What would you do if your child was struck across the face for simply sitting in the seat you paid for? Now ask yourself, what if that child didn't cry, didn't scream, just sat there, frozen, while the world around him stayed silent? This isn't a made-up drama. This happened. 30,000 feet in the air, on an ordinary flight. An extraordinary truth was revealed, and it all began with a boy quietly boarding first class. He was calm, respectful, alone, except for his caretaker. But to one flight attendant, he looked like he didn't belong. One slap, one moment, and everything changed. What followed in the next few hours would shake a corporation, ignite the internet, and force an entire country to ask itself, how do we treat those we don't expect to see in places of privilege? And what happens when silence is finally broken? You're about to hear a story that's not just about injustice, but about dignity, courage, and what it means to be seen. So if you believe stories like this deserve to be told, like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Now let's begin the story of the boy in seat 2A. Noah Mercer sat quietly at the gate, his phone resting in his hands, but his eyes not really focused on the screen. He scrolled now and then, but it was more out of habit than interest. Across from him, Miss Leona watched carefully, her hands folded over a small leather handbag. She had been with the Mercer family since Noah was a toddler. Not just a caretaker, but more like a second grandmother, one who knew when to speak, and when silence mattered more. Noah was 16, not a child, not yet a man. His clothes were simple. Clean sneakers, a navy hoodie, jeans a little too long at the cuff. He looked like someone waiting for a friend, not the son of one of the most powerful airline moguls in the country. But today, there were no bodyguards, no publicist, no entourage. Just him and Miss Leona on a routine commercial flight. It was his first time flying without his father. He had always traveled in private jets or sat quietly beside Julian Mercer, his father, in first class where every detail was handled, every comfort guaranteed. But this time was different. Julian had told him, "You need to experience the world without my name going ahead of you." Noah had nodded. He had agreed. But inside, he felt a coil of nervous energy tightening slowly. Still, he said nothing. When boarding was called, Miss Leona stood first, her movements calm and precise. She carried a soft overnight bag in one hand and gestured for Noah to follow. He walked beside her, pulling his backpack tighter to his shoulder. He handed the gate agent his boarding pass without speaking. The woman scanned it and smiled politely. "Enjoy first class," she said. Noah gave a small nod. "Thank you." The walk down the jet bridge felt longer than usual, not because of distance, but because of what he carried: expectation, uncertainty, and the quiet hope that everything would go smoothly. Inside the cabin, first class glowed with soft lighting and a faint scent of leather and citrus. Piano music drifted lightly through the air. Rows of wide seats greeted them. Polished armrests, linen headrests, champagne already being poured 3 rows down. Miss Leona placed their carry-ons into the overhead compartment, while Noah eased into his seat 2A by the window. He exhaled slowly, almost unconsciously. The leather was cool under his fingers. He slid on his headphones but didn't start any music, just held them loosely around his neck. Miss Leona sat beside him in 2B. She glanced his way. "You okay?" she asked softly. Noah nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." He didn't tell her he was thinking about his father, about whether he'd remember everything Julian had told him, about how quiet the world felt when you didn't wear your last name like armor. Miss Leona handed him a small note, folded. He opened it slowly. It was handwritten in black ink. Be calm. Be kind. Be yourself. That's always enough. Dad Noah didn't smile, but the weight in his chest lifted a little. He folded the paper carefully and slid it into the front pocket of his hoodie. Then she arrived. The flight attendant, tall, blonde hair tucked tightly into a twist, red lipstick, ironed uniform, name tag Valerie. She smiled as she passed a middle-aged couple in 1C and 1D, her voice light, cheerful. But when she reached row 2, something changed. Her smile faltered. Her eyes shifted to Noah and stayed there. She didn't greet him, didn't ask if he wanted a drink. She looked him up and down like she was doing math in her head. Then her gaze moved to Miss Leona. "Excuse me," she said. "Are these your seats?" Miss Leona responded gently, already pulling the boarding passes from her purse. "Yes, ma'am. Seats 2A and 2B. Valerie took the tickets, barely glanced at them. "This cabin is reserved for first-class passengers only," she said flatly. Noah looked up. Miss Leona's eyebrows rose. "Yes. These are our seats." Valerie crossed her arms. "If these were printed wrong, we can help you find your assigned seats in the main cabin." Noah felt a flush rise up his neck. His palms grew warm. He didn't speak. "Not yet." "These are not wrong," Miss Leona said. A firmer tone now. His father booked them directly. "We checked in early." She opened her phone, showing the confirmation email. Valerie didn't even look. "That won't be necessary," she snapped. "Please gather your belongings. I don't want to have to ask again." The cabin around them had grown quiet. Not silent, but quieter. A woman 2 rows up adjusted her scarf slowly, trying to pretend she wasn't listening. A man across the aisle lowered his magazine an inch. Noah's voice was small. "This is my seat." Valerie looked directly at him. "Are you talking back to me?" And then it happened. She struck him, a sharp slap across his face. Quick, sudden, loud enough to echo. Gasps. Even the pilot's overhead chime seemed to pause. Miss Leona froze, her hand still holding the phone, eyes wide with disbelief. Noah didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just blinked, stunned. His cheek stung, but the pain wasn't the worst part. It was the disbelief, the humiliation, the heat behind his eyes. Valerie straightened her uniform. "Don't raise your voice again," she warned. Then she turned and walked away. Noah's fingers reached for his phone. He typed 5 words. "She hit me. Seat 2A." And then he pressed send. Miss Leona turned toward him, voice low and trembling. "Are you okay?" Baby Noah nodded, but his jaw was tight. He didn't understand what had just happened. Not really. And yet, he did. Valerie Knox moved down the aisle, like she had a mission to complete and no time for questions. She carried herself with an air of practiced authority, the kind that often went unchallenged in uniform. But something had shifted since she struck that boy. Something sharp and irreversible. She had walked away like nothing happened, but nothing felt the same. The air in the cabin wasn't just quiet, it was thick, still. Eyes were watching her, even if they weren't meeting hers. Conversations had paused. Pretended distractions took over magazines, phone screens, iced drinks with condensation running down untouched. In seat 2A. Noah Mercer sat rigid, head turned slightly toward the window. His cheeks still glowed red, not from pain anymore, but from humiliation. The sting on his skin had already faded, but the one in his chest was just beginning to bloom. Beside him, Miss Leona leaned slightly toward him, speaking in a whisper that only someone who had raised him would recognize as a warning and comfort all in one. "You don't have to say anything yet," she murmured. "Just breathe." He nodded once. His fingers curled lightly around the phone in his lap. He had already sent the message. That part was done. Now came the part where something either happened or didn't. Back near the galley, Valerie stopped and placed a tray down harder than she meant to. A junior flight attendant, Emily Tran, looked up from sorting napkins. "Everything all right?" she asked cautiously. Valerie didn't answer. She turned to reach for a bottle of water, then paused. "There's a boy in 2A. Hoodie, sitting with an older woman. I don't think they're supposed to be up here," she said. Emily blinked. "Did they show you their tickets?" "Yes, but something felt off," Valerie replied. Voice clipped. "Off." How Valerie turned slightly, avoiding eye contact. They didn't look like they belonged. Emily didn't respond at first. She watched Valerie's face carefully. "They're calm, not causing trouble." Valerie's eyes narrowed. "He back-talked me." Emily tilted her head, confused. She had seen them bored, had even nodded politely as the boy passed by. "I don't think he said anything loud," Emily said slowly. "I know what I saw," Valerie snapped, "and I handled it." Emily looked down at her hands, folded on the counter. Something in her chest tugged. Handled it, how Valerie didn't answer. The silence that followed said enough. Emily said nothing more. She returned to folding napkins, her jaw clenched just slightly. She had been on flights where things got tense, passengers refusing to comply, people growing rude or aggressive. But this, she hadn't heard shouting. She hadn't heard any warning. And still, something had happened, and it had happened fast. Back in seat 2A. Noah's phone vibrated again. It was a reply. 4 words. "Where exactly are you?" he typed back quickly. "Still in 2A. She said I didn't belong here. She slapped me, in front of everyone." Miss Leona sat straighter when she saw the look on his face. "Is that your dad?" Noah nodded. She lowered her voice even further. Did he respond? He nodded again. Just then, a new message appeared on screen. "Don't move. I'm on this flight. I'm coming." Noah's fingers froze. He looked up, scanning the rows ahead and behind. His father on the plane. He hadn't seen him, had no idea he was even flying today. But of course, that's how Julian Mercer did things. Quietly, with precision. Noah didn't speak. He simply folded his hands together again, resting them on the armrest between him and Miss Leona. 3 rows back, a man in a dark blazer slowly rose from his seat. He didn't hurry. He didn't raise his voice. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, straightened his posture, and began walking down the aisle with the weight of someone who understood power, but didn't need to announce it. Passengers looked up as he passed. Some stared a beat too long. A woman lowered her coffee cup without sipping. Julian Mercer walked like a man who had walked down 1,000 boardrooms, like someone who knew what justice sounded like when spoken in a low, calm voice. Valerie turned in time to see him approaching. Her expression flickered. Recognition crept into her features, but not of his identity, just of something dangerous approaching. Julian stopped next to seat 2A. He looked at Noah first. His son's eyes met his. Noah didn't speak. He didn't need to. Julian turned slowly to face Valerie. "You struck my son?" Valerie blinked, mouth parting slightly. I didn't realize." Julian raised a hand gently, cutting her off. "You didn't realize that he was my son, or that you put your hands on a minor who had done nothing wrong." Valerie stepped back instinctively. I thought, he wasn't supposed to be in this section. He didn't look. Julian's eyes sharpened. Did you check his ticket? Yes. I saw it. But did you verify with the crew roster? Confirm his seat? Valerie didn't answer. Passengers had stopped pretending not to listen. The air had stilled. You made a decision, Julian said calmly. Not based on policy, not based on behavior, based on what you saw, based on your assumption. Valerie looked around, now aware of how many eyes were on her. He said something. She tried weakly. He talked back. Noah, still seated, looked up. All I said was that it was my seat. Valerie's mouth opened, then closed again. Julian turned toward the galley and gestured toward Emily. Get the captain on the line, please. Now. Emily hesitated just a second before nodding and moving swiftly. Julian looked down at his son. You okay? Noah nodded slowly, but his voice was soft. I didn't know what to do. Julian sat down in the empty aisle seat across from him. You did what I raised you to do, he said gently. You stayed calm. You told the truth. You didn't let her pull you into what she wanted. Noah looked at the floor. It didn't stop her. Julian nodded. No, but now it won't be ignored. A moment later, Emily returned. Holding the crew's intercom handset, Julian stood again, took the phone, and spoke clearly. This is Julian Mercer. I'm requesting immediate action. Remove the attendant from passenger interaction. Inform ground security that she is to be met at the gate. I want her suspended pending internal review. Emily nodded again and relayed the instructions. Her face was pale. Julian handed the phone back and turned once more to Valerie. You're done for this flight. Do not speak to another passenger. Do not move unless told to. Valerie stood still for a second, stunned. Then she turned and began walking slowly toward the rear of the plane. No one clapped. No one cheered. But the silence behind her was louder than applause. The cabin had returned to its routine, but nothing about it felt normal anymore. People sipped their drinks, flipped through in-flight magazines, or stared blankly at the seatback screens. Yet there was a strange, collective awareness floating between them all. Everyone had witnessed something irreversible, but no one knew how to talk about it. Noah Mercer sat quietly in his seat, his body still, his posture straighter than before. His cheeks still held a faint red mark, like the outline of something much heavier than a hand. Miss Leona had wiped his face gently with a folded napkin, her movements tender but controlled. She had said nothing more. Neither had Noah. Their silence wasn't a lack of emotion. It was an effort not to unravel right there in front of everyone. 3 rows behind, Julian Mercer sat with one leg crossed over the other, his back upright, his fingers loosely interlocked in his lap. He hadn't said a word since the call with the captain. He didn't need to. His presence was doing more than enough. Near the rear of the plane, Valerie Knox stood in the galley beside a metal cabinet. Her hands rested stiffly on the counter. She could hear the faint hum of the engines, the clicks of buttons being pressed, and now and then, whispers. She wasn't sure if they were about her, but she was pretty sure they were. She had served hundreds of flights, dealt with difficult passengers, smoothed over arguments, handled delays and angry parents with screaming toddlers. But this had never happened before. She had never been called out. Not like that. Not publicly. Not in front of a full cabin. And she had never struck anyone. Until today. She told herself it had been instinct, an impulsive reaction. He had raised his voice. Or maybe he hadn't. Her memory was starting to fracture. Not because it was unclear, but because she didn't want to remember it clearly. Valerie's jaw clenched as she reached for a cup and filled it with water. Her hand shaking, just slightly. She tried to steady her breath, but it came out in shallow waves, across from her. Emily Tran stood near the jump seat, arms folded. She hadn't said anything since Valerie returned, but her expression spoke volumes. "You're judging me," Valerie muttered. Emily hesitated, then said quietly, "No, I'm watching." Valerie turned her head slightly, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "I've been in this job 15 years. I know when someone's trying to sneak into a seat they didn't pay for. Did you check the ticket? I saw it. But did you really look?" Valerie didn't answer. Her lips parted, but no words came. Emily unfolded her arms and leaned forward just slightly. "He was sitting quietly. He had a boarding pass. And you still decided he didn't belong." Valerie bristled. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone, but you did." The words hung in the air, quiet, but weighted. Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, a woman in her early 30s sat in seat 1C, her eyes drifting between her e-reader and Noah's row. Her name was Camilla Daly. She had seen the whole thing unfold, the ticket, the accusation, the slap. Her heart had dropped when it happened. She had almost said something. Almost, but like everyone else around her, she stayed seated, silent, afraid of making it worse, or maybe afraid of stepping into something that felt too big, too charged. She watched the boy now, the way he sat still like he was holding himself together by force. Not because he didn't feel anything, but because he couldn't afford to fall apart in front of people who had already decided who he was. Camilla leaned over to the businessman beside her. "Did you see what happened earlier?" He nodded slowly. "Hard to miss. And you didn't think to say anything." He glanced toward her, surprised by the sharpness in her voice. "I didn't know what to say." She looked back toward the aisle. Neither did he, and he still got hit. The man looked away, guilt settling in like dust. Back in 2A. Noah reached slowly into the front pocket of his hoodie and pulled out the folded note from his father. He hadn't opened it again since they boarded. Now, he unfolded it carefully, smoothing the creases. "Be calm. Be kind. Be yourself. That's always enough." He stared at the last sentence. That's always enough. He wasn't so sure anymore. He folded the note again and placed it on his lap. Miss Leona glanced at it, then at him. "He meant every word," she said softly. Noah didn't answer, not because he didn't believe her, but because something had changed inside him, something small but sharp. He had never been one to make noise, never raised his voice in class, never talked back at home. He'd always been praised for being mature, for being thoughtful. But this morning, none of that mattered. His calm hadn't protected him. His kindness hadn't earned him space. His silence hadn't spared him from judgment. He didn't want to be brave. He just wanted to fly, to watch a movie, to land safely and go home. But instead, he had been made into a problem. And now everyone on that plane knew it. Julian Mercer stood slowly from his seat again. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. He didn't say a word as he moved forward to the cockpit. Inside, Captain Derek Monroe looked up as Julian approached. The phone call from earlier still echoed in his ears. The name Mercer wasn't just recognizable, it was untouchable. Julian nodded once. "I assume we're clear on the protocol." "Yep, sir," the captain replied. "She will be met by ground security and is to remain on the aircraft until escorted." Julian didn't smile. He didn't thank him. He simply turned and walked back to his seat. As he passed Noah, he reached out briefly and placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder. Just a moment. Just enough. Noah didn't move, but his eyes closed for half a second. The smallest breath left his chest. Back in the galley, Valerie sat on the edge of the jump seat, staring down at her lap. Her name badge felt heavier than it ever had. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out her crew-issued notepad. Slowly, she opened to a clean page. Today, I let pride speak louder than reason. She stared at the sentence for a long time. She didn't know if she wrote it for herself or for someone else, but it was the first thing she had written all day that didn't feel like a defense. Emily watched her from the other side of the galley. She didn't say anything. She just stood there, bearing witness. The engines hummed steadily. Passengers shifted in their seats. And somewhere above the clouds, the plane kept cruising forward, but inside, everything had shifted. The boy in seat 2A hadn't moved, hadn't shouted, hadn't demanded anything. But still, the entire cabin had been forced to look at him. To see him, not for who they thought he was, but for what had been done to him. And somehow, that was louder than anything else. The note from his father sat unfolded on Noah's lap. His fingers rested lightly on the paper, the soft hum of the engines vibrating faintly through the floor. Around him, the cabin remained unusually quiet. Not the usual luxury stillness of first class, but something more weighted, more aware. People weren't looking directly at him anymore, but they weren't relaxed either. Their shoulders were tight. Their gazes occasionally drifted in his direction, only to snap back toward windows or phone screens. Everyone had seen it happen, and no one had done anything. That made everything feel heavier. Miss Leona sat beside Noah, her expression unreadable, though her hand never strayed far from his arm. She had always been composed, always knew how to protect without creating scenes. But today, her restraint was fighting a battle with her instincts. Noah had barely spoken since the slap. He didn't want to. He didn't know how. Everything inside him felt crowded. And even if he tried, he wasn't sure anyone would listen now for the right reasons. When Julian Mercer walked past him toward the cockpit earlier, Noah had felt a quiet wave of relief, like someone finally opened a door and let in air. But now, with his father seated only a few feet away, he didn't feel saved. He felt complicated. He glanced again at the message thread on his phone. The last one from his father was still glowing on the screen. "Don't move. I'm on this flight. I'm coming." Julian hadn't made a scene. He never did. That wasn't his way. He moved with purpose, not noise. People underestimated that, mistook calm for passivity. But Noah had seen it firsthand, the way boardrooms quieted when his father entered, the way lawyers, partners, and executives sat straighter when he spoke. Because he didn't waste energy proving himself. He just made sure the results spoke louder than the room. Noah folded the note again, slower this time. He tucked it into the same pocket as before and looked out the window. Clouds drifted lazily across the sky, glowing gold in the afternoon sun. If he looked only at that, he could almost pretend it was a normal flight. Almost. Behind them, Valerie Knox remained seated in the rear galley, her uniform still perfectly pressed, but her body tense. The moment Julian had spoken her full name to the captain, everything had shifted for her. Not because she was afraid of losing her job, though that fear was there, but because the moment echoed too loudly in her own head. She hadn't even thought to ask the boy's name. Not once. She saw a hoodie. She saw skin tone. She saw someone young and quiet and assumed. The kind of assumption that doesn't feel malicious in the moment, but later reveals itself for what it really is, unquestioned bias disguised as authority. She replayed the slap in her mind again and again. The movement, the sound, the stunned look on his face, the gasp from a nearby row, and the stillness that followed like a punishment she hadn't been prepared for. In front of her, Emily Tran remained near the service station. She had not spoken to Valerie since that quiet confrontation earlier, but now she glanced over and said softly, "Do you know his name yet?" Valerie didn't answer. Her throat felt dry. She swallowed, but the lump didn't go away. "Noah," Emily continued gently. "His name is Noah Mercer." Valerie blinked. The last name hit like a low wave rolling through her chest. Mercer. She had seen that name somewhere before, heard it mentioned in training calls, read it on staff memos. Julian Mercer, the owner of the very airline she worked for. That's why the captain didn't ask questions. That's why the younger attendant responded so quickly. That's why the man's calm voice carried so much weight. She had slapped the son of the man who paid for the seat she sat in. She turned her face away, not to hide from Emily, but from the weight of her own realization. In first class. Camilla Daly sat staring down at her tray table. She hadn't touched her drink. The condensation had pooled beneath it, wetting the edge of her book. She didn't move it. Her eyes kept drifting back to seat 2A. The boy was still there, still calm, still dignified, and it made her sick to her stomach. She had sat there. She had watched the whole thing. She had told herself it wasn't her place to get involved. But now, hours later, all she could think about was that sound, that sharp, unforgivable sound of skin meeting skin. She glanced toward the man beside her, Mr. Langston, who still had his magazine open but hadn't flipped the page in 30 minutes. "She didn't even ask him anything," Camilla whispered. Langston didn't respond. She didn't ask his name. She didn't ask if the seat was his. She just assumed, like she knew better. Langston finally closed the magazine and sighed. "I was wrong not to say anything." Camilla looked at him. "We all were." He nodded, slowly. "At the front of the cabin." Julian stood again. He moved toward the flight attendant call button and signaled one of the standby crew. A different face this time. A young man with kind eyes who approached quickly and professionally. "I need to send a message to ground operations," Julian said calmly, "and I want confirmation when it's received." The young attendant nodded. "Of course, sir. What should I relay?" Julian reached into his blazer and pulled out a folded card. On it, an ID number embossed in gold ink. At the bottom, a line that read, "Executive Family Access, Tier 1. This flight has video capture in the cabin. Correct? Yes, sir. All first-class flights are covered by silent security feed. Then I want the footage flagged. I want full review before we land. I want names on record and incident reports opened before the wheels touch ground. I'll let them know immediately." Julian nodded and returned to his seat. He didn't look back at Valerie. He didn't need to. In seat 2A. Noah closed his eyes for a moment. The silence around him wasn't empty. It was filled with judgment, discomfort, regret. But none of it came from him. None of it belonged to him. He had done nothing, and that clarity was starting to plant its roots. Miss Leona reached for his hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "You know what's happening now?" she asked. Noah opened his eyes and looked at her. "They're watching him," he said softly. "Not me." Miss Leona nodded. That's how justice starts. From the back of the plane. Valerie finally stood. Her legs felt heavy. Her mind was racing. She wasn't sure what she expected to happen when they landed, but she knew it wasn't going to be simple. She had made a decision, not because she was sure, but because she thought she wouldn't be questioned. But now, everything about that moment was being questioned. And this time, she had no one to hide behind. The message had been sent, not just the one on Noah's phone, but the unspoken one carried through the eyes of every passenger who had watched quietly and now sat with their guilt. They all saw the same thing: a quiet boy, a calm man, and the brutal sound of a slap that couldn't be explained away. Somewhere high above the Mississippi River, the plane cruised through calm skies, but inside the cabin, no one felt steady. The atmosphere had thinned, not from altitude, but from the kind of tension that happens when something cruel unfolds in front of too many polite people who choose silence instead of courage. Noah Mercer remained in seat 2A, eyes fixed on the screen in front of him. The movie playing on the seatback monitor was on pause. He hadn't hit play once. The tray table in front of him remained up. His headphones hung loosely around his neck, but no sound played. It wasn't that he didn't want to be distracted. It was that he couldn't be, because every inch of this plane was whispering, not out loud, but in quiet guilt. Every time someone shifted in their seat, every cough that cut through the silence, every sideways glance when they thought he wouldn't notice, it all said the same thing. We saw it happen, and we said nothing. Miss Leona sat beside him, hands resting in her lap. She had aged in the last 2 hours, not physically, but emotionally. She had watched too many years pass where things like this were swept under the rug, where people who looked like her were told they were too sensitive, too loud, too much. But this was different. This time, the world had seen it through the lens of a boy who had done everything right and still ended up bruised. She looked over at Noah and smiled gently, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Tell me what you're feeling," she said, voice low. He shook his head. "I don't know how to name it." "Try." He took a breath. Let it out slowly. "It's not anger, at least not only. It's more like disappointment that I expected better, and shame that I still hoped someone would say something. You did nothing wrong." She said, "I know. That's the part that scares me. I did nothing, and it still wasn't enough to be seen." Behind them, Julian Mercer had not moved. He was still seated in row 5D, posture perfectly composed, gaze steady. He didn't need to pace or raise his voice. Power like his moved differently. He had spent years learning that real leadership was not volume. It was precision. His fingers tapped slowly on the armrest, not from anxiety, but calculation. Every word he had spoken so far had been intentional. Every action taken had been recorded in the minds of the crew. But there was still one thing left to do before the plane touched the ground. One thing he had not yet decided how to address: the passengers, because the people around him were complicit, not in action, but in absence, and he had to decide whether to leave that unspoken or to hold up a mirror. Further down in coach, people had begun to piece together what had happened in first class. Whispers moved like wind between rows. A man up front had been struck. The crew was in trouble. Someone important was on board. No names were spoken. But the tension was catching. Back in the rear galley, Valerie Knox sat alone. She had stopped fidgeting, stopped pretending to rearrange service trays. She just sat, elbows on her knees, eyes on the floor. She hadn't tried to justify it again, not since she had learned the boy's last name, not since the captain had confirmed that ground security would be meeting them upon arrival. It wasn't just her job on the line anymore. It was her entire belief system. She had always thought of herself as professional, experienced, fair. But none of those words meant anything when she couldn't explain what made her think that boy didn't belong. Not without revealing something uglier than she wanted to admit. She covered her face with both hands. In the forward galley, Emily Tran reviewed her crew log. Her hands moved quickly, jotting notes into the incident report. She didn't trust herself to remember the details later, not the way they needed to be remembered. She paused and looked toward Valerie's name on the staffing sheet. For a moment, she wondered how long Valerie had worked this way. How many passengers before Noah had received that same look, that same suspicion, and how many had been too afraid to speak up. She thought of her younger brother, same age as Noah, same quiet eyes, and she realized, painfully, that if roles were reversed, she wouldn't want anyone else to stay silent either. She turned the page and wrote in large letters at the top. He said nothing wrong. He followed every rule. He was struck anyway. In seat 1C. Camilla Daly clutched a pen from her purse. She had found a blank page in her travel notebook and begun to write. Not because she had any specific message in mind, but because she needed to get the weight out of her chest. I saw it happen. She wrote. I didn't speak. I was afraid. And now, that silence feels worse than the slap. Beside her. Mr. Langston shifted uncomfortably. He looked like a man preparing for a meeting he wasn't qualified to attend. His suit was expensive, but today it offered no protection. He glanced toward the front of the cabin, toward the boy. He lowered his gaze again. Across the aisle, Julian Mercer stood. This time, his movement was slow, intentional. He walked toward the front and turned to face the cabin. No one said a word. I won't take long, he began, voice calm. I'm not here to shame anyone. I'm not here to perform outrage. I'm here because silence makes cowards of decent people. He let the words settle. My son was struck today. Not because he misbehaved, not because he raised his voice, but because someone decided he didn't belong. And the worst part is, most of you saw it, and you stayed seated. A man cleared his throat 2 rows back, but he said nothing. I don't need apologies, Julian continued. My son doesn't need pity, but I think all of you need to ask yourselves what exactly were you waiting for? Permission to care. A louder voice to follow. He took a breath. Noah doesn't get to hide from this moment. Neither do I, and neither should you. The silence after his words was unlike anything that had come before. Not awkward, not resistant, just real. Julian nodded once and returned to his seat. Noah stared at his father for a long moment, his eyes wide. Then slowly, he looked around the cabin, and this time, the passengers looked back, not away, not through him, at him. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't even close to justice. But it was something. It was presence, recognition. Camilla reached into her bag and pulled out the notebook. She tore out the page she had written and carefully folded it. She stood and walked the few steps to seat 2A. Excuse me, she said gently. Noah looked up. I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. Not for what she did, but for what I didn't do. She handed him the note and returned to her seat. He unfolded it and read her words. Then, without speaking, he nodded once and placed the paper beside his father's note, and slowly the silence began to loosen its grip, not with applause, not with grand gestures, but with something quieter, something that had been missing for hours. Humanity. Julian Mercer sat back down in his seat with a weight that didn't come from gravity. He exhaled, slow and quiet, as if he were releasing more than just breath. All around him, the cabin felt different now. Not resolved, not healed, but disturbed, in a necessary way, like an old floorboard that had finally creaked loud enough to be noticed. Passengers shifted in their seats. The quiet wasn't the kind that came from boredom or sleep. It was the quiet of people reevaluating themselves. Noah Mercer looked down at the folded note in his lap, the one Camilla had handed him. He hadn't opened it again. Not yet. He didn't need to. Her voice and her eyes had already said more than the words on that page ever could. He had accepted her apology, not because it erased what happened, but because it acknowledged it. And in his world, acknowledgement was a currency rarer than gold. Miss Leona sat still, though her hands had finally unclenched from her lap. She studied Julian closely. She had known him since before he had his first board seat, back when he had big dreams and a newborn son and a world not built to respect either. Watching him now, she saw something she rarely allowed herself to say aloud. He wasn't just rich. He wasn't just successful. He was dangerous to systems that relied on people like him staying silent. She leaned over and whispered to Noah, "This is where it begins. Right here. Not in courtrooms. Not in headlines. Here. With people watching when they thought no one would." Noah nodded. He didn't look up. In the rear galley, Valerie Knox sat on the cold metal jump seat, arms wrapped around her waist. The adrenaline had worn off. Now there was only weight and memory and questions she didn't want to answer. She didn't know how to label what she was feeling. Regret didn't feel like enough. Shame was too tidy. Guilt came in waves, not steady. She thought about her daughter, 17, about to graduate high school. She had taught her to speak clearly, to trust her instincts, to always ask questions. But Valerie hadn't asked any today. She had assumed. An assumption had a face now. A bruise. A name. Noah. The name had stuck to the inside of her head like a post-it note she couldn't peel away. She heard footsteps. Looked up. Emily Tran stood in front of her, a small water bottle in hand. She offered it without speaking. Valerie took it. "Thanks," she murmured. Emily didn't move. "What are you going to say when they ask you about it?" she asked softly. Valerie blinked. "Who grounds staff? HR? The press?" Valerie hesitated. "I don't know." Emily tilted her head. "Then maybe start by telling the truth. All of it. Not just what makes you look a little less guilty." Valerie flinched at the word guilty. "I wasn't trying to hurt him," she said. Emily didn't nod. Didn't disagree. She just said, "But you did." Valerie gripped the bottle tighter. "What would you have done if you thought someone was in the wrong seat?" "I would have asked. I would have checked the manifest again. I would have waited for them to speak before deciding who they were." Valerie's face tightened. "That sounds nice in theory." Emily leaned in. "That's not theory. That's policy." Silence stretched between them until Valerie looked away. In the cockpit, Captain Derek Monroe sat with his co-pilot, listening over the crew headset to updates from ground control. They were 37 minutes from landing. "We've got confirmation from airport security," the co-pilot said. "They'll meet the aircraft at the gate. Internal Affairs has also been notified." The captain nodded. "Is Mercer's identity confirmed to Terminal Command?" "Yes, sir. They know who he is and who his son is." Captain Monroe looked through the glass at the endless blue horizon ahead of them. He didn't know the boy personally, had only seen him in passing before departure. But now, He carried responsibility, too. This had happened on his plane, under his watch. He tapped his fingers against the throttle, not in frustration, in contemplation, in the main cabin. Camilla Daly stared out her window, but she wasn't seeing anything. Her mind kept returning to her own son, 9 years old, wide-eyed, constantly asking questions. She wondered what kind of man he would grow up to be, whether he would ever sit on a plane like this, quietly trying to be invisible just to stay safe. She hoped not. She turned to look at Noah again. He hadn't flinched once since the incident, hadn't cried, hadn't lashed out, and that strength broke her heart. She stood again, walked back to her seat, pulled out her phone. She opened the Notes app and began to write. To the boy in 2A. You were brave without asking to be. You were strong without demanding it. And because of you, we're all being forced to see ourselves more clearly. She didn't send it, just saved it. But the act of writing it made something settle in her chest. Julian stood again. This time, he didn't address the cabin. He walked directly to Valerie in the rear galley. Emily stepped aside silently. Valerie stood up, unsure what to do with her hands. She didn't expect him to speak first. But he did. I'm not here to humiliate you. She nodded. Eyes down. I'm not here to argue either. Her voice was thin. Then why are you here? Because you're going to have to live with this long after the press forgets it. And what you do next is the only thing that might matter. She looked up, confused. I don't understand. Julian spoke calmly. Most people are only ever remembered for their worst moment, but some people are remembered for how they handled what came after. Valerie swallowed. I'm scared. I imagine he was too. And he was just a kid. Her voice cracked. I thought I was protecting the cabin. I really did. Julian nodded once. Then protect it now. Tell the truth, every part of it. He turned to walk away, but paused. And remember his name. Not because of who I am, but because of who he is. Back at 2A. Noah watched his father return. There was something different in the way Julian sat this time. Less guarded, less angled. He had said what needed to be said. Now, it was time to wait. Passengers stared forward again. Some looked ashamed. Some looked quietly grateful. A few, like Camilla, looked changed. When the captain came over the intercom to announce they would begin descent shortly, the usual shuffle of trays and murmurs didn't begin. People just listened, and for the first time all flight, the silence felt earned, not forced, not afraid, earned. The landing announcement came with a soft chime and the captain's steady voice echoing through the cabin. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll begin our descent into Birmingham shortly. Please ensure all carry-ons are stowed and your seat backs are in the upright position. The usual rustling followed passengers shifting, attendants preparing, but the mood on this flight was different. There was no idle chatter, no one jostling to reach the overhead bins too early. Every movement was slow, considered. Noah Mercer sat still, staring at the seatback screen in front of him, though it remained dark. His hands were folded tightly in his lap. Miss Leona gently reached over and placed her hand on his, grounding him. You ready? She asked. He shook his head slowly. No, but I'm not scared. That was new. She gave him a proud look. Good. In the rear of the plane. Valerie Knox was adjusting her blazer in the narrow mirror of the galley door. She looked at her own reflection like she didn't quite recognize the person staring back. There was no undoing what had happened. She had crossed a line, and there was no softening the truth now. Every excuse she had rehearsed in her mind sounded thinner the more she tried to use it. She looked into her own eyes and whispered, "Tell the truth. Every part of it." It was what Julian Mercer had told her, and now it echoed louder than anything else. A sharp knock on the galley door pulled her back to the present. Emily stood just outside, with a message card in her hand. "They want you on the intercom," she said. Valerie's eyebrows drew together. Why, Emily's face was unreadable. "Mr. Mercer requested it. Said the passengers deserve an update before landing." Valerie stiffened. "They want me to speak after what happened." Emily nodded. "He doesn't want a polished company apology. He wants you to speak like a person." Valerie's stomach turned. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for the card. "Take a breath," Emily added. "Softer this time. And don't speak for the airline. Just speak for yourself." Valerie nodded once and walked toward the intercom panel. Up front. Julian watched the cabin with sharp attention. When Valerie's voice finally came on over the speaker, the room tensed again. "This is Valerie Knox, lead flight attendant on this flight," she began, her voice steady but low. "Before we land, I've been asked to address an incident that happened in this cabin earlier today. No one moved. Every head tilted upward, every eye fixed on the small speaker above their seat. Today, I made a judgment I can't take back. I made an assumption about a passenger based on something I didn't question deeply enough, and I acted on it in a way that was unacceptable, harmful, and wrong." Noah's eyes widened. He sat straighter. "I struck a passenger who had done nothing wrong." Valerie continued, voice beginning to crack. "A young man who was in the seat he was assigned, who had followed every rule, and who remained respectful even when I failed to do the same." Miss Leona put a hand over her mouth, not in shock, but in awe. "I am not asking for your forgiveness," Valerie said. "I'm asking for your attention, because we cannot claim to be professionals, to be fair, or to be safe, if we only apply those principles selectively." Somewhere in coach, a man who had watched the confrontation from behind his newspaper lowered it entirely for the first time all flight. "I will be held accountable when we land, and I should be. But I also need you to know that I'm not just an employee of this airline. I'm a person, and today, I failed to be a good one." There was a pause, long enough to make people hold their breath. I hope Noah Mercer and every young black man in this country knows that their presence is not a threat. It is not suspicious. It is not less than. It is equal. Valerie took one final breath. "I failed, and I will answer for that. But I will not lie about it. Thank you." The speaker went silent. The cabin did not. Some passengers turned to each other in surprise. A few nodded solemnly. One woman pressed her hand to her heart. "And in seat 2A. Noah looked at Miss Leona and whispered, "She said my name." Leona wiped a tear from her cheek. "Yes, baby. She did." It was the first time he had heard it said out loud since the slap. Julian remained seated, arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but a flicker of something passed across his eyes. A recognition, not of victory, but of a shift, a beginning. 20 minutes later, the plane touched down with a smooth bounce. Passengers didn't rush to stand. For once, they waited, still seated as if they were waiting for instruction, as if the usual rules had been rewritten mid-air. The chime rang out again. The captain's voice followed. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have arrived in Birmingham. Please remain seated while we coordinate disembarkation. Security will be meeting us at the gate, so we appreciate your patience. In the front row." Camilla Daly placed her hand on the seat in front of her and stood slowly. She didn't reach for her bag yet. Instead, she turned toward Noah and Miss Leona. "May I?" she asked. Miss Leona smiled. "Of course." Camilla stepped over and crouched beside Noah's seat. "I don't know what happens next," she said gently, "but I wanted to tell you something before we all scatter." He met her gaze. "You reminded me today that silence is a choice, and I'm done choosing it." Noah didn't smile, but something in his shoulders softened. "Thank you," he said. Behind them, Mr. Langston stood too. He walked forward awkwardly, stopping beside Julian. "I was ashamed," he admitted. "Still am. But I'd like to offer a statement, if it helps." Julian nodded once. "Then do it. And don't wait for permission next time." The jet bridge finally connected. Ground crew entered the cabin quickly but discreetly. 2 plainclothes security officers made their way toward the rear galley. Valerie stood when she saw them, hands folded. She didn't resist, didn't cry. She just nodded and followed them down the aisle. As she passed seat 2A, she paused. She looked at Noah, and for the first time, all flight, their eyes met. "I'm sorry," she said aloud, "for everything." He looked back at her, held her gaze. "I heard you," he replied. She nodded once more, then turned and continued walking toward the exit. When it was time to leave, Noah stood slowly. His legs were stiff. His shoulders ached. But he felt taller somehow. As he walked past the rows of passengers, some offered quiet nods. Others looked away. A few said nothing at all. But Camilla stood, and Mr. Langston did too. And when Julian walked behind his son, he didn't need to say a word. The world had seen the boy in 2O, and now they would remember him. The moment Noah stepped off the jet bridge, the air felt heavier, not hotter, not thinner, just different. Inside the terminal, lights hummed overhead and passengers moved with the usual aimless energy of an airport, but none of that reached Noah. His senses were fixed on the small group of people waiting just beyond the security gate uniformed officers, airport staff in vests, and 2 figures in suits holding tablets at their sides. Julian walked just behind him, calm, poised, each step deliberate. Miss Leona kept to Noah's left, matching his stride without saying a word. She could sense what the boy was feeling. The way the world suddenly looked too big, too watching. But she also knew this was the moment he would begin to understand something his father had always known. Visibility is a double-edged sword. They were halfway to the security team when one of the suited women stepped forward. "Mr. Mercer," she said, addressing Julian. "My name is Angela Chen, Internal Counsel for Horizon Sky Airlines. May I speak with you and your son for a moment?" Julian nodded once. Angela's voice was low and even. "We're reviewing video from the flight. I've already been briefed by the captain and the ground coordination. I'd like to offer private space for a preliminary statement from your family before we proceed with staff debriefing. I assume your legal team has reviewed the company's liability exposure?" Julian asked flatly. Angela nodded. "We have, and we understand this may extend beyond a private incident." Julian gestured toward Noah. "Then he'll speak, in his own words." Angela's eyes shifted to Noah, her expression softening slightly. "Would that be okay with you?" "Noah." Noah hesitated. Then he nodded. Angela led them to a quiet lounge room just off the terminal walkway. Frosted glass windows and a closed door gave it a strange, corporate warmth, like it was meant to be comfortable, but only just enough to keep lawsuits civil. Inside were 2 chairs, a low table, and a bottle of water with untouched paper cups. Noah sat, his hands folding automatically in his lap. Miss Leona sat beside him. Julian remained standing, arms crossed, just behind the chair. Angela tapped on her tablet. "For the record, can you tell me what happened?" "In your own words," Noah cleared his throat. "I boarded the plane with Miss Leona. She's our house manager. We were both seated in first class. I had seat 2A. She had 2B. Angela nodded, typing quietly. "The flight attendant, Mrs. Knox, came over before takeoff. She asked to see our tickets. I showed mine. She looked at it, then looked at me, and she said something like, 'You don't belong here.'" Angela paused her typing. "Did she raise her voice?" "No." Noah said, "But she didn't need to. She was angry. And when I said the seat was mine, she slapped me." Silence fell in the room for a moment. Angela looked up. "Did you say anything that might have been interpreted as confrontational?" "I told her it was my seat," Noah replied, his voice even. "That's all." Julian spoke quietly. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't curse. The entire cabin saw it, and they saw her strike him. Angela sighed. "I've already requested the cabin security footage. We're reviewing it now." Miss Leona leaned forward. "It's not just about what she did. It's about why she thought she could do it." Angela looked down, uncomfortable. "I understand, and I don't disagree." Julian stepped forward. "Then I want you to understand, this isn't going away. I'm not interested in hush settlements or shallow apologies." Angela nodded. "I figured as much. Mr. Mercer, with your permission, we'd like to move forward with a formal investigation. Ms. Knox has been placed on administrative leave effective immediately." "That's a start," Julian said. "But this needs more than HR paperwork. You need to look inward, at your training, your hiring, your culture." Angela closed her tablet. "Understood." A quiet knock interrupted the room. Emily Tran poked her head in, visibly nervous. "Excuse me," she said softly, "but I'd like to offer a statement too, if that's allowed." Angela turned to Julian. He nodded. Emily stepped inside, hands shaking just slightly. "I saw it happen. I didn't intervene, but I heard what Ms. Knox said. I saw the slap, and I froze, and I've regretted it since." Angela gestured to a seat. "Please, have a seat. We'll record your account as well." Noah looked up at her, surprised. Emily caught his eye. "I should have said something sooner," she whispered. "I'm sorry." Noah nodded slowly. "You're saying it now." For a while, the room filled with the sounds of voices giving accounts. Emily, Miss Leona, and finally, Julian himself. Each word etched into digital memory. Back in the terminal, passengers from the flight began spilling into the main corridor. Some stopped at cafes, others walked straight for baggage claim. But more than a few lingered, as if unsure whether they were supposed to go on with their lives like nothing had happened. Camilla Daly stood near the large window that overlooked the runway. She held her phone in one hand, camera app open, but she wasn't recording. She was looking at her reflection. She tapped the screen and began typing into her notes. Flight 4826 from Atlanta to Birmingham. A boy was struck because someone assumed he didn't belong. A man stayed calm and spoke the truth. And somewhere in between, we all got reminded what silence costs. She looked up again. She didn't know what the news would do with this story, but she knew what she would do. Speak. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the control tower and the sky turned honey gold. Julian, Noah, and Miss Leona exited through the VIP terminal. A black sedan waited outside. Julian opened the door for his son, then paused before he got in. "You okay?" he asked. Noah nodded. "I think so. Want to talk more? Maybe later." Julian smiled slightly. "We've got time." Inside the car, Noah sat beside the window. For the first time all day, he allowed himself to feel tired. The adrenaline was gone. The spotlight had moved, but something deeper stayed with him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out both folded notes, the one from Camila and the one from his father. He placed them side by side in his lap. Two different voices, two different kinds of truth, but both, now, part of who he was. And as the car pulled away from the terminal, the weight in his chest didn't feel quite so heavy. Not because everything was fixed, but because, for once, the truth hadn't been buried. It had been heard. It started with a tweet. Camilla Daly had posted it just before midnight. She didn't write much, just a single sentence paired with a photo she had taken at the gate. "I watched a black teenager get slapped by a flight attendant today for sitting in the seat he paid for. His father didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He held the cabin accountable with just his presence. By morning, it had over 480,000 likes. The photo wasn't dramatic. It was a shot of Noah and Julian walking through the terminal. No faces, just silhouettes. Side by side, the tall man and the boy beside him, framed by airport light and a waiting black sedan. Still, the image said more than paragraphs could. Noah hadn't even known it was taken. Neither had Julian. But by sunrise, they were the center of a storm they didn't start. Every major news outlet picked it up by ADA. Cable networks debated it. Online forums dissected it. Hashtags began trending. No, seat 2A. He belonged there. Flying while black. Julian received 3 missed calls from his PR team before breakfast. His inbox was flooded with inquiries. Statements were being drafted. Camera crews were already parked outside the Horizon Sky corporate office. But inside the Mercer home, the mood was quiet. Noah sat at the kitchen table, his hoodie sleeves pushed up, cereal soggy in front of him. He wasn't looking at his phone. He wasn't scrolling. He was just staring at the notes from yesterday, his father's words, and the page from Camilla. He had read them at least 20 times. Each time, they settled differently in his chest. Julian walked in, carrying a mug of coffee. He moved slowly, deliberately, not wanting to shake the fragile calm in the room. He sat across from his son. "They're asking for interviews," he said after a long pause. "Press, podcasts, even a couple talk shows." Noah didn't respond right away. Then, softly, "Do I have to say something?" Julian said. "But if you want to, I'll stand beside you." Noah looked up. "Will it change anything?" Julian thought for a long moment. Maybe not everything, but it might change something for someone. That answer landed, not perfectly, but with enough weight to hold on to. Miss Leona walked in next, carrying her tablet. "You made the front page of the Ledger," she said, placing it gently on the counter. The headline was sharp, clear, and unapologetic. Flight 4826. Incident sparks national outrage over racial profiling at 30,000 feet. Noah's eyes scanned the page. His name wasn't mentioned directly in the headline, but it didn't need to be. Everyone knew now. They published the footage. Julian asked, "Not the airline yet?" She replied, "But someone on the flight leaked a clip." "From a phone." Julian's jaw tightened. "Let me see it." Leona tapped play. The video was shaky but clear enough. Valerie Knox stood over Noah, pointing at his ticket. There was no audio, but the body language said it all. The slap landed halfway through the clip. Gasps could be heard. Noah's stillness afterward was almost more devastating than the strike itself. Julian watched it only once. Then, quietly, turn it off. Noah hadn't watched it at all. He didn't need to. Across the city, at Horizon Sky's corporate tower, Angela Chen sat in a glass-walled conference room, speaking rapidly into a phone while toggling between browser tabs. A panel of executives sat on a video call, their expressions tense. "We need to lead with accountability," she said. "We don't bury this. We face it." One of the men on screen interrupted. "What if we offer a confidential settlement before it gets worse?" Angela shot him a look. "It's already worse." She turned back to her team. "Valerie Knox's personnel file is being reviewed. We'll publish a preliminary report within 48 hours. And I'll personally reach out to the Mercer family by noon." Another woman on the call spoke up. "And what about disciplinary action for crew that didn't intervene?" Angela paused. "We ask ourselves who froze out of fear and who chose to do nothing." The room went quiet. In her apartment, Emily Tran sat cross-legged on her living room floor, laptop open, news clips playing. Her name hadn't been mentioned in the media. She wasn't seeking attention. But she watched the coverage because she needed to understand what the rest of the world was seeing. She scrolled through comments. Some were horrifying, racist, ignorant, dismissive, but others were loud with support. People were sharing their own experiences, not just on flights, but in classrooms, stores, offices, moments where they were questioned before they had even spoken. Emily opened her email. Her draft to HR was still there, unsent. She added a line. "I believe I failed a passenger by not speaking sooner. I would like to be interviewed about the incident and provide my written testimony." She hit send. Meanwhile, in a quiet suburb outside the city, Valerie Knox sat on her back porch. Her uniform blazer hung over a chair. Her phone buzzed nonstop, but she didn't answer it. Her name was now on every platform. She was trending for all the wrong reasons. Her face had been frozen in that slap. She had read the comments, the outrage, the disgust. But what hurt the most weren't the strangers. It was her daughter. The night before, her daughter had stood in the hallway, holding her own phone, and said quietly, "Mom, why would you do that?" Valerie hadn't had an answer. She still didn't. She sat with her coffee, watching morning mist drift across the backyard lawn. Her hands were shaking, not because she had been caught, but because she had finally seen herself clearly, and it terrified her. She picked up her phone, scrolled to her notes. She began typing. "I slapped a child I knew nothing about. Not because of his actions, because of his presence. And I hate who I became in that moment." She stared at the words. She didn't know if she'd ever publish them, but writing them made her feel, for the first time, like she wasn't hiding anymore. Back in the Mercer home. Noah finally turned his phone over and unlocked the screen. Messages poured in. Some from classmates. Some from people he'd never met. One read, "You were so calm. I don't think I could have done that. You're stronger than most adults I know." Another, "My brother is 12. He saw the clip, and now he knows he's not alone. Thank you." He read until his eyes blurred. Then he looked up at his father. "I'll do it," he said. "I'll speak, but not for the press. For me." Julian nodded. "Then let's write your story, in your voice." They sat side by side at the kitchen table, father and son, two keyboards open, and for the first time since the flight, Noah began to type his own words. My name is Noah Mercer. I was the boy in seat 2A, and this is what happened to me. Noah Mercer had never seen his own name in so many places before. It showed up in hashtags, in news headlines, on TikTok clips edited with swelling piano music. His face was blurred in some videos, clear in others. His voice, which barely spoke above a whisper during the flight, was now echoing across millions of screens. But he hadn't spoken for the world yet, until now. He sat in the den at home, the afternoon sun casting a warm glow across the hardwood floor. Julian had left the room to give him privacy, but the door stayed cracked just slightly, his silent way of saying, I'm still here. Noah opened his laptop and stared at the blinking cursor. He didn't want to write something for attention. He didn't need applause. He needed space to tell the truth as it had been lived, not just seen. He started typing. I am not a hero. I didn't do anything brave. I sat in a seat. I showed my ticket. I waited to take off. And I was hit. The words came easier than he expected. I didn't know what to say when it happened. I still don't know how to describe it completely, but I know what it felt like. It felt like shrinking, like disappearing, and then it felt like everyone saw me, but too late. He paused, then added, When people say I was calm, I want them to know it wasn't because I was okay. It was because I've been taught since I was little that staying calm is sometimes the only way we stay safe, especially when our skin makes people nervous. He looked at the words and reread them. He thought about deleting that last line. Then he didn't. Instead, he continued, The woman who hit me never asked my name. She didn't ask if it was my seat. She decided I didn't belong there, and then acted like that gave her permission. But the thing that stayed with me most wasn't the slap. It was how quiet everyone else stayed. Noah leaned back and wiped his eyes with his sleeve. The silence was louder than her voice. That's what really hurt. Downstairs. Julian checked his phone and saw the timestamp of the document autosaving. He didn't rush his son. He didn't interfere. He knew this part wasn't about parenting. It was about letting the boy become his own kind of man. Upstairs, Noah kept writing. When my dad stood up, everything changed. Not because he owns an airline, but because he showed me something I didn't realize I needed. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He just stood with me. And for the first time that day, I didn't feel alone. He stopped, took a deep breath, and kept going. I know people are sharing this story now. I see the comments. I hear what everyone's saying. Some people think I should be angry. Some think I should forgive. The truth is, I'm still figuring that out. I'm not ready to forgive. But I'm not here to stay angry either. His fingers slowed as he neared the end. What I want is simple. I want people to look at a kid like me and not think I'm a problem that needs correcting. I want people to believe I belong, even before I prove it. I want the next boy in seat 2A to feel safe. And I want people to remember that silence is a choice. You can choose differently. He ended with my name is Noah Mercer. And this is what happened to me. He hit save. He didn't cry. Not because he wasn't moved, but because he felt steady for the first time in days. The storm had swirled around him, but now he had found the eye of it, a place where he could breathe. Julian returned quietly and sat beside him. You finished it? He asked. Noah nodded. I think so. Julian read the document in silence, eyes scanning slowly, carefully. When he finished, he didn't say anything at first. He just reached out and put a hand on Noah's shoulder. I couldn't have written it better, he finally said. Noah let out a small breath, half laugh, half release. Julian added, "Do you want to publish it through our PR team?" Noah shook his head. "No, I want to post it myself. My page, my voice." Julian smiled. "Good." Within the hour, the post was live. No filters, no press quote. Just the words, line after line, plain and honest. By nightfall, it had been shared over 1 million times. Emily Tran read it from her apartment, tears in her eyes. She forwarded it to the airline's ethics committee with a note. "He wrote the story we were too afraid to live in the moment." Camilla Daly read it in bed, holding her son close, her heart both breaking and healing at once. Mr. Langston forwarded it to his law firm with a memo attached. "Let's examine our onboarding assumptions, starting now." And Valerie Knox, still under review, still silent, read it alone. Her face flushed with something deeper than shame. She didn't comment. She didn't repost. She just reread it over and over, each sentence another mirror she could not turn away from. The following day, news anchors quoted from the piece. The silence was louder than her voice. One said. Another added, "I want the next boy in seat 2A to feel safe." That line has stayed with millions overnight. Horizon Sky Airlines released a formal statement by noon. Not a denial, not a spin, but a commitment. They cited Noah's post directly, promising a review of bias training, reporting structures, and internal accountability for all flight staff. Julian had not demanded it, but his son's words had moved mountains where corporate memos had only tiptoed before. Noah stayed home from school that week, not because he was afraid to face people, but because he needed time to exist again as a teenager. Not a symbol. Still, every day, more letters arrived. A girl from Detroit wrote, "I wear my hoodie like armor, but now I'll wear it with pride." A teacher from Arizona said, "Thank you for teaching my classroom what empathy looks like." A pilot from Los Angeles sent a typed letter that read, "I've flown for 22 years. You reminded me why I started and what I need to do better." Noah kept them all in a shoebox by his bed, not to hold on to fame, but to hold on to truth. He understood now that stories don't just change the world when they're loud. Sometimes they change the world when they're honest, when they're real, and when the people at the center of them refuse to shrink. 3 days after Noah's story was published, Horizon Sky Airlines made headlines again. But this time, it wasn't because of what happened on Flight 4826. It was because of what they chose to do next. A press release landed in every major outlet. The airline announced the immediate launch of a task force to address racial bias in air travel. The initiative would be co-led by independent civil rights advocates and include a full review of customer interaction protocols, hiring policies, and escalation procedures. But the most surprising part came at the end of the statement. The company invited Noah Mercer and his father, Julian, to join the advisory board if they chose to. The offer was unprecedented. Inside the Mercer home. The announcement played on the living room TV as Julian and Miss Leona watched from the sofa. The air between them was thoughtful, not celebratory. "That's more than I expected," she said. "It's a start," Julian replied. "But they're not doing it out of kindness. They're doing it because the public is watching." Miss Leona nodded slowly. "Still, it's better than silence." Upstairs, Noah was reading messages from kids across the country, middle schoolers. high schoolers, even college students. Some shared drawings of Seat 2A. Others quoted his letter word for word. It was surreal. He hadn't meant to become anyone's voice, but maybe being heard, even once, could do more than he thought. He walked downstairs, holding his phone. "They want me to be on the board," he asked. Eyebrows raised. Julian nodded. "That's what they're saying." Noah hesitated. "Is that weird? Being invited to fix a system that tried to hurt you?" "Yeah." Julian thought about it for a second. "It's not weird. It's rare. And if you say yes, do it on your terms, not theirs." Noah looked down. "What if I mess it up?" Julian stood and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You wrote the truth when most adults would have stayed quiet. You've already done more than most people twice your age. If you speak in that room the same way you wrote on that page, you'll be fine." Noah nodded slowly. "I'll do it." That afternoon, Emily Tran received a calendar invitation marked Ethics Review Panel, Flight 4826. She opened it, heart racing. At the bottom of the invite, a note was added. "Staff who step forward in good faith will not be penalized. Your voice matters." She sat back in her chair, then clicked accept. Meanwhile, Valerie Knox stood at the edge of a different room, one far less forgiving. She waited in a small, sterile conference space inside Horizon Sky's HR headquarters. Her lawyer sat beside her, flipping through documents. Across from them sat two investigators, an HR director and Angela Chen. Angela spoke calmly. "Before we begin, Ms. Knox, I'd like to thank you for coming voluntarily." Valerie gave a slight nod. "We're here to discuss your actions aboard Flight 4826, the impact of those actions, and your reflections since the incident." Valerie took a breath. She had rehearsed this moment over and over, but none of the scripts she'd prepared felt useful anymore. So she did what she hadn't done that day on the plane. She told the truth. "I saw a young black boy sitting in first class, and I assumed he didn't belong. Not because he was disruptive, not because he was doing anything wrong, just because of how he looked." She stopped. The words sat in the air. Angela didn't respond. She let the silence speak. Valerie continued, "I slapped him. I didn't mean to hurt him, but I did. And then I doubled down. I kept insisting I was right. I let my pride speak louder than my reason." The HR director asked, "Were you aware of Mr. Julian Mercer's status at the time?" "No," she answered, "but that shouldn't have mattered." Angela leaned forward. "Why do you think it happened?" "Valerie." "Why him? Why that reaction?" Valerie's eyes welled, but she didn't look away. "Because I let my fear dress itself as protocol. I stopped seeing a person and only saw a threat that didn't exist." There was a pause. Then Angela said, "Thank you." "Will I be fired?" Valerie asked. "That decision hasn't been finalized." Angela replied, "But this isn't about punishment. It's about accountability. And the standard is higher now because of him." Across town, Julian and Noah entered the airline's main campus through a back entrance. Staff had been told not to crowd or photograph, but whispers still followed them like shadows. Inside a large conference room, the advisory board was already seated. A dozen members, civil rights attorneys, educators, a few airline executives, and 3 young advocates under the age of 25. Noah stood near the door, unsure where to sit. Angela spotted him and smiled gently. "Seat 2A is open," she said, nodding to a chair near the front. It was a small joke, but it broke the tension. Noah smiled for the first time that day. He sat. The meeting began with statistics, charts, reports. All the things that made systemic bias sound clean and clinical. Then they opened the floor. Noah didn't speak right away. He listened, really listened. Finally, when a long-winded executive started explaining the complexities of in-flight staffing, Noah raised his hand. "May I say something?" All heads turned. Angela gave him a nod. Noah stood. "I don't understand airline procedures the way you all do," he began. "But I do understand what it feels like when you're made small, when you're treated like a problem before you even speak." The room fell still. I sat in that seat because it was mine. But after I got hit, I felt like I didn't have the right to be there. That's what these moments do to us. They make us question whether we belong, even when we do everything right. He looked around the table. "If you want to fix this, you have to teach your staff to see people before they see policy. Train them to ask before assuming, and when something happens, don't make victims prove their humanity before they're believed." A quiet murmur passed through the room. Respectful. Moved. One of the attorneys leaned forward and said, "Would you consider helping us shape the new training language?" Noah blinked. "Me, yes." "You understand the weight of being underestimated? We need that voice in this room." Julian, seated in the corner, smiled quietly. After the meeting, as they walked back through the lobby, Noah turned to his dad. "I didn't think they'd listen. They didn't have a choice." Julian said, "You spoke the truth." Outside, reporters were still waiting at the gate. Cameras ready. Julian reached for the car door. Noah stopped. "Wait," he said. "Let me say one thing." Julian stepped aside. Noah approached the line of microphones. Flashes clicked. The crowd hushed. "I'm not here to be a symbol," he said. "I'm just here to be a reminder." He paused. "There are kids everywhere who carry themselves quietly, who follow the rules, who hope that being calm is enough to be safe. I was one of them." He stepped back. "Don't forget the boy in seat 2A. Then he turned and walked toward the car. And this time, no one looked away. Spring came late that year. It was the kind of slow, reluctant spring that crept in more through sunlight than warmth. Trees were just beginning to show their color again. And in a quiet auditorium tucked inside a downtown community center, the name Noah Mercer was printed on the back of every program. The event was small by national standards, but it felt enormous to everyone who showed up. A town hall forum hosted by a local youth leadership organization. They had asked Noah to speak, not as a celebrity, not as a headline, but as a young man who had something honest to say. Noah had been unsure about accepting. He had done the meetings. He had written the post. But this was different. This was face-to-face. This was real. Julian sat beside him in the front row, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit. Miss Leona was a few seats over, her phone in one hand, her other arm wrapped around a young girl who looked no older than 10. They had flown in from Atlanta just to hear him. Camilla Daly was there too, seated toward the back with her son, who clutched a copy of a laminated photo of seat 2A. It had become something of a symbol now. Not a monument, but a reminder. Noah stood when the host called his name. He stepped onto the stage in jeans and a blazer that didn't quite sit right on his shoulders yet. His shoes were clean but creased. He didn't hold notes. He didn't need to. He looked out over the rows of people, some smiling, others leaning forward as if they already knew this moment would stay with them long after the chairs were put away. "Thank you for coming," Noah began. "I know I'm not the most experienced speaker. I'm not a leader yet. I'm not even finished growing. But I do know something about being seen for the wrong reasons." A hush settled over the crowd. I never asked to be in the spotlight. I didn't plan to become a story. I was just trying to get from one city to another, and I ended up in the middle of something much bigger. He paused and took a breath. What happened to me on that flight was wrong. But what I remember most isn't the slap. It's how quiet everyone was after. The silence scared me more than anything else. He looked down, then up again. But since then, I've also seen the opposite. I've seen people speak up, even when it's uncomfortable. I've seen kids my age write letters, share stories, challenge adults, and I've learned something I didn't expect. He stepped forward slightly. We don't need to be older to start leading. We just need to be willing to tell the truth, even when our voice shakes. A ripple of nods moved through the room. Noah smiled, gently. I'm not here to tell you how to fix everything, but I do know this: if you ever see someone in seat 2A, or 12C, or standing in a hallway, or walking through a door, and your first thought is, they don't belong here, stop and ask yourself why. He let the words breathe, because the biggest changes don't happen through laws. They start in our minds and in our choices. The choice to ask instead of assume, to speak instead of stay quiet, to see instead of judge. There was a silence now, but this one felt earned, respectful, present. Noah looked out over the crowd one last time. My name is Noah Mercer. I was the boy in seat 2A, and I'm not invisible. When he stepped down from the stage, the applause came not like thunder, but like steady rain, a rhythm, a pulse, something that felt grounded and real. Backstage, Julian pulled him into a hug. I'm proud of you, he said. Noah nodded, his voice low. I felt like myself up there, not the version on the news, just me. That's all you ever needed to be, Julian said. In the days that followed, clips from the speech began to circulate online, not because it was sensational, but because it was sincere. Teachers played it in classrooms, parents shared it with their kids, even pilots posted about it, saying, we need to listen better, all of us. And somewhere in the middle of all that, Horizon Sky quietly renamed the first row of every new aircraft in its fleet. Seat 2A was now listed on every internal seating chart as the Mercer seat. No plaque, no advertisement, just a name in a database, and a note in the company handbook that read, let this seat remind us what listening can do. Valerie Knox received her final hearing a week later. She entered the room with her shoulders squared, her hair pulled back, and a typed letter in her hand. When asked if she had anything to say, she stood and read every word. I made a mistake that hurt a young man. I acted out of bias I wasn't willing to admit until it was too late. And I've spent every day since asking myself why. I now understand that recognition is not the same as repair, but I am ready to do the work, even if it takes the rest of my life. Her contract was not renewed, but her apology, for the first time, felt like more than a defense. It felt like a beginning. Emily Tran, now transferred to a new airline division focused on equity and training, kept a small printout of Noah's post taped above her desk. She used it in every new hire workshop, not as a cautionary tale, but as a challenge. Noah continued speaking at events, but only when it felt right. He never chased the spotlight. He never needed to. The story had already left his hands. It now belonged to the people who carried it forward. And seat 2A. It kept flying, from city to city, passenger to passenger. Sometimes it held a businessman too tired to speak. Sometimes a single mom trying to make it home. sometimes a kid who reminded someone of Noah. But wherever it went, the seat was no longer just a number. It was a space where people had to ask themselves what kind of world they were stepping into and what kind of person they were choosing to be. And for anyone who ever sat there and felt like they didn't belong, there would always be one name they could whisper under their breath and remember why they did. Noah Mercer, the boy in seat 2A, and the story that reminded a country what dignity really looks like. Some stories don't end with a final scene. They echo in every silent hallway, every judgmental glance, every moment someone is told without words, "You don't belong here." But Noah Mercer changed that. He didn't fight back with fists or fire. He used truth, calm, clarity, and the bravery to speak when others froze. From a single slap came a national reckoning. From one voice came the courage of thousands. He wasn't asking for attention. He was asking to be treated like a person. And now, because of him, Seat 2A will never just be a seat again. It's a symbol, a reminder that dignity doesn't have a dress code, and respect isn't optional. To those who remain silent in the face of injustice, your silence speaks volumes. And to those who speak up, even when it's hard, you are the reason stories like this matter. If this story moved you, if you felt seen, if you want to stand with the next Noah who takes their seat, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel, because this isn't the last story we'll tell, and the next one might just change something too.